The Letter of Aristeas. Since I have collected material for a memorable history of my visit to Eleazar the high priest of the Jews, and because you, Philocrates, as you lose no opportunity of reminding me, have set great store upon receiving an account of the motives and object of my mission, I have attempted to draw up a clear exposition of the matter for you, for I perceive that you possess a natural love of learning, a quality which is the highest possession of man to be constantly attempting to add to his stock of knowledge and acquirements, whether through the study of history or by actually participating in the events themselves. It is by this means, by taking up into itself the noblest elements, that the soul is established in purity, and having fixed its aim on piety, the noblest goal of all, it uses this as its infallible guide and so acquires a definite purpose. It was my devotion to the pursuit of religious knowledge that led me to undertake the embassy to the man I have mentioned, who was held in the highest esteem by his own citizens and by others both for his virtue and his majesty, and who had in his possession documents of the highest value to the Jews in his own country, and in foreign lands for the interpretation of the divine law. For their laws are written on leather parchments in Jewish characters. This embassy then I undertook with enthusiasm, having first of all found an opportunity of pleading with the king on behalf of the Jewish captives who had been transported from Judea to Egypt by the king's father, when he first obtained possession of this city and conquered the land of Egypt. It is worthwhile that I should tell you this story, too, since I am convinced that you, with your disposition towards holiness and your sympathy with men who are living in accordance with the holy law, will all the more readily listen to the account which I purpose to set forth, since you yourself have lately come to us from the island and are anxious to hear everything that tends to build up the soul. On a former occasion, too, I sent you a record of the facts which I thought worth relating about the Jewish race, the record which I had obtained from the most learned high priests of the most learned land of Egypt. As you are so eager to acquire the knowledge of those things which can benefit the mind, I feel it incumbent upon me to impart to you all the information in my power. I should feel the same duty towards all who possess the same disposition, but I feel it especially towards you since you have aspirations which are so noble, and since you are not only my brother in character no less than in blood but are one with me as well in the pursuit of goodness. For either the pleasure derived from gold nor any other of the possessions which are prized by shallow minds confers the same benefit as the pursuit of culture, and the study which we expend in securing it. But that I may not weary you by a too lengthy introduction, I will proceed at once to the substance of my narrative. Demetrius of Phalerum, the president of the king's library, received vast sums of money, for the purpose of collecting together, as far as he possibly could, all the books in the world. By means of purchase and transcription, he carried out, to the best of his ability, the purpose of the king. On one occasion when I was present he was asked, "How many thousand books are there in the library?" And he replied, "More than 200,000, O king, and I shall make endeavor in the immediate future to gather together the remainder also, so that the total of 500,000 may be reached. I am told that the laws of the Jews are worth transcribing and deserve a place in your library. What is to prevent you from doing this?" replied the king. "Everything that is necessary has been placed at your disposal. They need to be translated," answered Demetrius, "for in the country of the Jews they use a peculiar alphabet, just as the Egyptians, too, have a special form of letters, and speak a peculiar dialect. They are supposed to use the Syriac tongue, but this is not the case. Their language is quite different." And the king, when he understood all the facts of the case, ordered a letter to be written to the Jewish high priest that his purpose, which has already been described, might be accomplished. Thinking that the time had come to press the demand, which I had often laid before Sosibius of Tarentum and Andreas, the chief of the bodyguard, for the emancipation of the Jews who had been transported from Judea by the king's father, for when by a combination of good fortune and courage he had brought his attack on the whole district of Coele and Phoenicia to a successful issue. In the process of terrorizing the country into subjection, he transported some of his foes and others he reduced to captivity. The number of those whom he transported from the country of the Jews to Egypt amounted to no less than 100,000. Of these he armed 30,000 picked men and settled them in garrisons in the country districts. And even before this time large numbers of Jews had come into Egypt with the Persian and in an earlier period still others had been sent to Egypt to help Psammetichus in his campaign against the king of the Ethiopians. But these were nothing like so numerous as the captives whom Ptolemy the son of Lagus transported. As I have already said, Ptolemy picked out the best of these, the men who were in the prime of life and distinguished for their courage, and armed them. But the great mass of the others, those who were too old or too young for this purpose, and the women too, he reduced to slavery, not that he wished to do this of his own free will, but he was compelled by his soldiers who claimed them as a reward for the services which they had rendered in war. Having, as has already been stated, obtained an opportunity for securing their emancipation, I addressed the king with the following arguments. Let us not be so unreasonable as to allow our deeds to give the lie to our words. Since the law which we wish not only to transcribe but also to translate belongs to the whole Jewish race, what justification shall we be able to find for our embassy while such vast numbers of them remain in a state of slavery in your kingdom? In the perfection and wealth of your clemency release those who are held in such miserable bondage, since as I have been at pains to discover, the God who gave them their law is the God who maintains your kingdom. They worship the same God, the Lord and Creator of the universe, as all other men, as we ourselves, O King, though we call him by different names, such as Zeus or Dis. This name was very appropriately bestowed upon him by our first ancestors, in order to signify that he through whom all things are endowed with life and come into being, is necessarily the ruler and Lord of the universe. Set all mankind an example of magnanimity by releasing those who are held in bondage. After a brief interval, while I was offering up an earnest prayer to God that he would so dispose the mind of the king that all the captives might be set at liberty, for the human race, being the creation of God, is swayed and influenced by him. Therefore with many divers prayers I called upon him who ruleth the heart that the king might be constrained to grant my request. For I had great hopes with regard to the salvation of the men, since I was assured that God would grant a fulfillment of my prayer. For when men from pure motives plan some action in the interest of righteousness and the performance of noble deeds, Almighty God brings their efforts and purposes to a successful issue. The king raised his head and looking up at me with a cheerful countenance asked, How many thousands do you think they will number? Andreas, who was standing near, replied, A little more than 100,000. It is a small boon indeed, said the king, that Aristeas asks of us. Then Sosibius and some others who were present said, Yes, but it will be a fit tribute to your magnanimity for you to offer the enfranchisement of these men as an act of devotion to the supreme God. You have been greatly honored by Almighty God and exalted above all your forefathers in glory, and it is only fitting that you should render to him the greatest thank-offering in your power. Extremely pleased with these arguments, he gave orders that an addition should be made to the wages of the soldiers by the amount of the redemption money, that 20 drachmae should be paid to the owners for every slave, that a public order should be issued, and that registers of the captives should be attached to it. He showed the greatest enthusiasm in the business, for it was God who had brought our purpose to fulfillment in its entirety, and constrained him to redeem not only those who had come into Egypt with the army of his father, but any who had come before that time or had been subsequently brought into the kingdom. It was pointed out to him that the ransom money would exceed 400 talents. I think it will be useful to insert a copy of the decree, for in this way the magnanimity of the king, who was empowered by God to save such vast multitudes, will be made clearer and more manifest. The decree of the king ran as follows. All who served in the army of our father in the campaign against Syria and Phoenicia and in the attack upon the country of the Jews and became possessed of Jewish captives and brought them back to the city of Alexandria and the land of Egypt, or sold them to others, and in the same way any captives who were in our land before that time, or were brought hither afterwards, all who possess such captives are required to set them at liberty at once, receiving 20 drachmae per head as ransom money. The soldiers will receive this money as a gift added to their wages, the others from the king's treasury. We think that it was against our father's will and against all propriety that they should have been made captives, and that the devastation of their land and the transportation of the Jews to Egypt was an act of military wantonness. The spoil which fell to the soldiers on the field of battle was all the booty which they should have claimed. To reduce the people to slavery in addition was an act of absolute injustice. Wherefore, since it is acknowledged that we are accustomed to render justice to all men and especially to those who are unfairly in a condition of servitude, and since we strive to deal fairly with all men according to the demands of justice and piety, we have decreed, in reference to the persons of the Jews who are in any condition of bondage in any part of our dominion, that those who possess them shall receive the stipulated sum of money, and set them at liberty, and that no man shall show any tardiness in discharging his obligations. Within 3 days after the publication of this decree, they must make lists of slaves for the officers appointed to carry out our will, and immediately produce the persons of the captives. For we consider that it will be advantageous to us and to our affairs that the matter should be brought to a conclusion. Any one who likes may give information about any who disobeyed the decree on condition that if the man is proved guilty he will become his slave. His property, however, will be handed over to the royal treasury. When the decree was brought to be read over to the king for his approval, it contained all the other provisions except the phrase any captives who were in the land before that time, or were brought hither afterwards. And in his magnanimity, and the largeness of his heart the king inserted this clause and gave orders that the grant of money required for the redemption should be deposited in full with the paymasters of the forces and the royal bankers. And so the matter was decided and the decree ratified within 7 days. The grant for the redemption amounted to more than 660 talents, for many infants at the breast were emancipated together with their mothers. When the question was raised whether the sum of 20 talents was to be paid for these, the king ordered that it should be done, and thus he carried out his decision in the most comprehensive way. When this had been done, he ordered Demetrius to draw up a memorial with regard to the transcription of the Jewish books. For all affairs of state used to be carried out by means of decrees and with the most painstaking accuracy by these Egyptian kings, and nothing was done in a slipshod or haphazard fashion. And so I have inserted copies of the memorial and the letters, the number of the presents sent and the nature of each, since every one of them excelled in magnificence and technical skill. The following is a copy of the memorial. The memorial of Demetrius to the great king. Since you have given me instructions, O king, that the books which are needed to complete your library should be collected together, and that those which are defective should be repaired, I have devoted myself with the utmost care to the fulfillment of your wishes, and I now have the following proposal to lay before you. The books of the law of the Jews, with some few others, are absent from the library. They are written in the Hebrew characters and language and have been carelessly interpreted, and do not represent the original text as I am informed by those who know, for they have never had a king's care to protect them. It is necessary that these should be made accurate for your library, since the law which they contain, inasmuch as it is of divine origin, is full of wisdom and free from all blemish. For this reason literary men and poets, and the mass of historical writers have held aloof from referring to these books and the men who have lived and are living in accordance with them, because their conception of life is so sacred and religious, as Hecataeus of Abdera says. If it please you, O king, a letter shall be written to the high priest in Jerusalem, asking him to send 6 elders out of every tribe, men who have lived the noblest life and are most skilled in their law, that we may find out the points in which the majority of them are in agreement, and so having obtained an accurate translation may place it in a conspicuous place in a manner worthy of the work itself and your purpose. May continual prosperity be yours. When this memorial had been presented, the king ordered a letter to be written to Eleazar on the matter, giving also an account of the emancipation of the Jewish captives. And he gave 50 talents weight of gold and 70 talents of silver and a large quantity of precious stones to make bowls and vials and a table and libation cups. He also gave orders to those who had the custody of his coffers to allow the artificers to make a selection of any materials they might require for the purpose, and that 100 talents in money should be sent to provide sacrifices for the temple and for other needs. I shall give you a full account of the workmanship after I have set before you copies of the letters. The letter of the king ran as follows. King Ptolemy sends greeting and salutation to the high priest Eleazar. Since there are many Jews settled in our realm who were carried off from Jerusalem by the Persians at the time of their power, and many more who came with my father into Egypt as captives, large numbers of these he placed in the army, and paid them higher wages than usual. And when he had proved the loyalty of their leaders, he built fortresses, and placed them in their charge that the native Egyptians might be intimidated by them. And I, when I ascended the throne, adopted a kindly attitude towards all my subjects, and more particularly to those who were citizens of yours. I have set at liberty more than 100,000 captives, paying their owners the appropriate market price for them. And if ever evil has been done to your people through the passions of the mob, I have made them reparation. The motive which prompted my action has been the desire to act piously and render unto the Supreme God a thank offering for maintaining my kingdom in peace and great glory in all the world. Moreover, those of your people who were in the prime of life I have drafted into my army, and those who were fit to be attached to my person and worthy of the confidence of the court, I have established in official positions. Now, since I am anxious to show my gratitude to these men and to the Jews throughout the world and to the generations yet to come, I have determined that your law shall be translated from the Hebrew tongue which is in use amongst you into the Greek language, that these books may be added to the other royal books in my library. It will be a kindness on your part, and a regard for my zeal if you will select 6 elders from each of your tribes, men of noble life and skilled in your law and able to interpret it, that in questions of dispute we may be able to discover the verdict in which the majority agree, for the investigation is of the highest possible importance. I hope to win great renown by the accomplishment of this work. I have sent Andreas, the chief of my bodyguard, and Aristeas, men whom I hold in high esteem, to lay the matter before you and present you with 100 talents of silver, the first fruits of my offering for the temple and the sacrifices and other religious rites. If you will write to me concerning your wishes in these matters, you will confer a great favor upon me and afford me a new pledge of friendship, for all your wishes shall be carried out as speedily as possible. Farewell. To this letter Eleazar replied appropriately as follows. Eleazar the high priest sends greetings to King Ptolemy, his true friend. My highest wishes are for your welfare, and the welfare of Queen Arsinoe your sister, and your children. I also am well. I have received your letter, and am greatly rejoiced by your purpose and your noble counsel. I summoned together the whole people and read it to them that they might know of your devotion to our God. I showed them too the cups which you sent, 20 of gold and 30 of silver, the 5 bowls and the table of dedication, and the 100 talents of silver for the offering of the sacrifices and providing the things of which the temple stands in need. These gifts were brought to me by Andreas, one of your most honored servants, and by Aristeas, both good men and true, distinguished by their learning, and worthy in every way to be the representatives of your high principles and righteous purposes. These men imparted to me your message and received from me an answer in agreement with your letter. I will consent to everything which is advantageous to you, even though your request is very unusual. For you have bestowed upon our citizens great, and never to be forgotten benefits in many ways. Immediately therefore I offered sacrifices on behalf of you, your sister, your children, and your friends, and all the people prayed that your plans might prosper continually, and that Almighty God might preserve your kingdom in peace with honor, and that the translation of the Holy Law might prove advantageous to you and be carried out successfully. In the presence of all the people I selected 6 elders from each tribe, good men and true, and I have sent them to you with a copy of our law. It will be a kindness, O righteous king, if you will give instruction that as soon as the translation of the law is completed, the men shall be restored again to us in safety. Farewell. The following are the names of the elders, of the first tribe, Joseph, Ezekiah, Zach. Ariah, John, Ezekiah, Elisha. Of the second tribe, Judas, Simon, Samuel, Adias, Mattathias, Eshlemias. Of the third tribe, Nehemiah, Joseph, Theodosius, Basias, Ornias, Dakis. Of the fourth tribe, Jonathan, Abrias, Elisha, Ananias, Chabrias. Of the fifth tribe, Isaac, Jacob, Jesus, Sabbatius, Simon, Levi. Of the sixth tribe, Judas, Joseph, Simon, Zacharias, Samuel, Selenius. Of the seventh tribe, Sabbatius, Zedekiah, Jacob, Isaac, Jesus, Nathias. Of the eighth tribe, Theodosius, Jason, Jesus, Theodotus, John, Jonathan. Of the ninth tribe, Theophilus, Abraham, Arzamas, Jason, Andemias, Daniel. Of the 10th tribe, Jeremiah, Eleazar, Zachariah, Banias, Elisha, Dathias. Of the 11th tribe, Samuel, Joseph, Judas, Jonathes, Chabu, Dositheus. Of the 12th tribe, Icelus, John, Theodosius, Arsamas, Abites, Ezekiel. There were 72 in all. Such was the answer which Eleazar and his friends gave to the king's letter. I will now proceed to redeem my promise and give a description of the works of art. They were wrought with exceptional skill, for the king spared no expense and personally superintended the workmen individually. They could not therefore scamp any part of the work or finish it off negligently. First of all, I will give you a description of the table. The king was anxious that this piece of work should be of exceptionally large dimensions, and he caused inquiries to be made of the Jews in the locality with regard to the size of the table already in the temple at Jerusalem. And when they described the measurements, he proceeded to ask whether he might make a larger structure. And some of the priests and the other Jews replied that there was nothing to prevent him. And he said that he was anxious to make it 5 times the size, but he hesitated lest it should prove useless for the temple services. He was desirous that his gift should not merely be stationed in the temple, for it would afford him much greater pleasure if the men whose duty it was to offer the fitting sacrifices were able to do so appropriately on the table which he had made. He did not suppose that it was owing to lack of gold that the former table had been made of small size, but there seems to have been, he said, some reason why it was made of this dimension. For had the order been given, there would have been no lack of means. Wherefore we must not transgress or go beyond the proper measure. At the same time he ordered them to press into service all the manifold forms of art, for he was a man of the most lofty conceptions and nature had endowed him with a keen imagination which enabled him to picture the appearance which would be presented by the finished work. He gave orders too, that where there were no instructions laid down in the Jewish scriptures, everything should be made as beautiful as possible. When such instructions were laid down, they were to be carried out to the letter. They made the table 2 cubits long, 1 cubit broad, 1.5 cubits high, fashioning it of pure solid gold. What I am describing was not thin gold laid over another foundation, but the whole structure was of massive gold welded together. And they made a border of a hand's breadth round about it. And there was a wreath of wave work, engraved in relief in the form of ropes marvelously wrought on its 3 sides. For it was triangular in shape, and the style of the work was exactly the same on each of the sides, so that whichever side they were turned, they presented the same appearance. Of the 2 sides under the border, the one which sloped down to the table was a very beautiful piece of work, but it was the outer side which attracted the gaze of the spectator. Now the upper edge of the 2 sides, being elevated, was sharp since, as we have said, the rim was 3-sided, from whatever point of view one approached it. And there were layers of precious stones on it in the midst of the embossed cord work, and they were interwoven with one another by an inimitable artistic device. For the sake of security, they were all fixed by golden needles which were inserted in perforations in the stones. At the sides they were clamped together by fastenings to hold them firm. On the part of the border round the table which slanted upwards and met the eyes, there was wrought a pattern of eggs and precious stones, elaborately engraved by a continuous piece of fluted relief work, closely connected together round the whole table. And under the stones which had been arranged to represent eggs the artists made a crown containing all kinds of fruits, having at its top clusters of grapes and ears of corn, dates also and apples, and pomegranates and the like, conspicuously arranged. These fruits were wrought out of precious stones, of the same color as the fruits themselves, and they fastened them edgeways round all the sides of the table with a band of gold. And after the crown of fruit had been put on, underneath there was inserted another pattern of eggs and precious stones, and other fluting and embossed work, that both sides of the table might be used, according to the wishes of the owners, and for this reason the wavework and the border were extended down to the feet of the table. They made and fastened under the whole width of the table a massive plate 4 fingers thick, that the feet might be inserted into it, and clamped fast with linchpins which fitted into sockets under the border, so that whichever side of the table people preferred might be used. Thus it became manifestly clear that the work was intended to be used either way. On the table itself they engraved a meander, having precious stones standing out in the middle of it, rubies and emeralds and an onyx too, and many other kinds of stones which excel in beauty. And next to the meander there was placed a wonderful piece of network, which made the center of the table appear like a rhomboid in shape, and on it a crystal and amber, as it is called, had been wrought, which produced an incomparable impression on the beholders. They made the feet of the table with heads like lilies, so that they seemed to be like lilies bending down beneath the table, and the parts which were visible represented leaves which stood upright. The basis of the foot on the ground consisted of a ruby, and measured a hand's breadth high all round. It had the appearance of a shoe and was 8 fingers broad. Upon it the whole expanse of the foot rested. And they made the foot appear like ivy growing out of the stone, interwoven with acanthus and surrounded with a vine which encircled it with clusters of grapes, which were worked in stones, up to the top of the foot. All the 4 feet were made in the same style, and everything was wrought and fitted so skillfully, and such remarkable skill and knowledge were expended upon making it true to nature, that when the air was stirred by a breath of wind, movement was imparted to the leaves, and everything was fashioned to correspond with the actual reality which it represented. And they made the top of the table in 3 parts like a triptychon, and they were so fitted and dovetailed together with spigots along the whole breadth of the work, that the meeting of the joints could not be seen or even discovered. The thickness of the table was not less than half a cubit, so that the whole work must have cost many talents. For since the king did not wish to add to its size, he expended on the details the same sum of money which would have been required if the table could have been of larger dimensions. And everything was completed in accordance with his plan, in a most wonderful and remarkable way, with inimitable art and incomparable beauty. Of the mixing bowls, 2 were wrought in gold, and from the base to the middle were engraved with relief work in the pattern of scales, and between the scales precious stones were inserted with great artistic skill. Then there was a meander a cubit in height, with its surface wrought out of precious stones of many colors, displaying great artistic effort and beauty. Upon this there was a mosaic, worked in the form of a rhombus, having a net-like appearance, and reaching right up to the brim. In the middle, small shields which were made of different precious stones, placed alternately and varying in kind, not less than 4 fingers broad, enhanced the beauty of their appearance. On the top of the brim there was an ornament of lilies in bloom, and intertwining clusters of grapes were engraven all round. Such then was the construction of the golden bowls, and they held more than 2 firkins each. The silver bowls had a smooth surface, and were wonderfully made as if they were intended for looking glasses, so that everything which was brought near to them was reflected even more clearly than in mirrors. But it is impossible to describe the real impression which these works of art produced upon the mind when they were finished. For, when these vessels had been completed and placed side by side, first a silver bowl and then a golden, then another silver, and then another golden, the appearance they presented is altogether indescribable, and those who came to see them were not able to tear themselves from the brilliant sight and entrancing spectacle. The impressions produced by the spectacle were various in kind. When men looked at the golden vessels, and their minds made a complete survey of each detail of workmanship, their souls were thrilled with wonder and delight, and they were so much impressed by the artistic skill displayed, that for very astonishment they thought that they must be looking upon a supernatural vision. And again, when they turned their eyes upon the silver vessels, and saw the complete harmony and accuracy with which they reproduced the objects reflected in them, they were once more impressed with amazement and wonder. And the golden vials and the libation cups, and the large bowls were finished in the same style. They were made to rest upon a basis, and around the base there was a wreathed network, 4 fingers broad, which had figures of living creatures engraved upon it, and on the surface there was a mosaic work which was interwoven with precious stones of every kind. On the top of the bowl all round there was a lily wreath and intertwining clusters of grapes. There were 2 golden vials, 2½ cubits high from base to lip. Upon their sides lilies were wrought, and intertwining clusters of grapes, and the base and the lip were all wrought in the same fashion. Thus it was made evident that from the outset everything had been constructed with a single purpose and in the same style. The weight of the gold was 20 talents, and that of the silver was 30 talents. The workmen were under the necessity of giving extreme attention to every detail of the work, in order that they might turn out everything in accordance with the king's wishes, for he loved to survey the works as they proceeded towards perfection. As a general rule he took his meals and transacted business, and rested in the midst of the workmen in the place where the works were being constructed. The general character of the plan and its execution were carried out as I have described. When all had been finished according to the king's wish, he ordered us to sail for the places already mentioned with a view to presenting the gifts to the god. We started off on the journey, and when we reached the territory of the Jews, we saw the city situated in the middle of the whole of Judea upon the top of a mountain of considerable altitude. On the summit the temple had been built in all its splendor. When we arrived at the city, the whole population, including the high priest and the priests, met us at the site. The priests stood arrayed in their sacred vestments, and the Levites with their instruments of music. The multitude of the citizens was innumerable. They stood round the place in throngs and gave us a magnificent reception. The whole city was filled with rejoicing and praise. The Jews were magnificently clad, and their city was well provided with everything. When we approached the city, in accordance with the custom of the priests, they sprinkled us with water, in order to purify us, and received us magnificently. After we had passed through the country for nearly 6 stadia, we arrived at the high wall, which had been built in the style of a tower and formed a perfect defense to the temple. We ascended a great flight of steps, and reached the temple enclosure. There we prostrated ourselves in adoration before the holy God and greeted the high priest and the priests and all the rest of the people. The robes of the high priest were marvelous in their splendor, as also the distinguishing garment which he wore, having golden bells with beautiful pomegranates, adorned with many-colored flowers of marvelous hues, and of the most wonderful workmanship. He was clad in an extraordinary robe, of purple, woven through with gold, and wearing on his breast the oracle of God. This was in the form of a gold brooch, and on it were embedded 12 stones of different kinds set in gold, upon which the names of the leaders of the tribes according to their original order were engraved. Each stone flashed with such a distinctive brilliance, that any one of those who looked at them could not fail to be astonished. Attached to his head by a golden band was the turban, which is the headdress of the high priest, and in the middle of it inlaid in relief in gold upon a plate was the name of God. He that is, Exodus 3 verse 14. Their appearance when seen makes a profound impression upon one, for they inspired every one who looked at them with awe and confusion of mind, so marvelous was the effect of the whole arrangement. Their appearance was unapproachable by human eyes, and they made one feel as if one had come into the presence of a man who belonged to another world. I am convinced that any one who takes part in the spectacle which I have described will feel great astonishment, and will be profoundly affected in his mind, and will realize that he has been brought into the presence of works which are wrought not by human hands but by the hand of God. When we had been there 3 days, and the formalities connected with our mission had been completed, we returned to the place where we were lodging. And as the meeting was convened by the high priest, we were invited to the banquet. Now the seating arrangement was in accordance with a certain definite order. The seats were placed in the proper position for the guests who sat down first. They were placed exactly opposite to one another in double rows. They had been provided in a circle round the place where they would be seated, and were of a very costly kind, for silver and gold had been freely employed for the construction of every one of them. They were arranged according to the order of the ceremonial of the priests, and in accordance with the dignity of each guest. And having taken their seats in the proper order, they enjoyed themselves, and the meal was served. It was carried round to them in golden dishes, and all the proper arrangements had been made for this in accordance with the law. Before the banquet was concluded, the high priest began to speak in a kindly way about us and asked us about the object of our mission, and when we had explained it in detail, he proceeded to expound the law to us, explaining point by point and inquiring whether we wished to make any remarks, for the investigation of the law was of the highest importance to the men who were there. Then I said that it was necessary that we should first offer a complete explanation to the king about our mission and our business, and the details about the letters, and should give a full account of the answer which we brought back, and the gifts which the high priest had bestowed upon the king as an expression of the highest honor and goodwill. And I said that it was important to investigate these points before all the people, that they might understand the matter thoroughly. And when we had given a full explanation, they expressed their astonishment, and were very eager to hear about the sacred law, and I said that it was necessary first to offer a sacrifice to God, and then to recite the law to the people, and the priests and the Levites and the elders of the people must take their stand in the temple, while the multitude of the people should remain outside, and we, having accomplished our mission and performed our sacred duties, must offer the sacrifices which we had brought with us, and then return to our own country. And they all said that this was a very reasonable plan, and the high priest gave orders that everything should be done as I had said. He gave instructions to the priests to summon the whole people to the temple on the third day, and the priests and the Levites were to take up their position in the sacred precincts, and we were to bring the gifts and offer them to God. And when the whole congregation had assembled, the priests and the Levites and the elders of the people, together with us, went up to the temple. And they performed the sacrifice, and offered the gifts and gave thanks to God. And when we had performed all that we had been ordered to do, we departed, having been magnificently entertained, and the high priest gave us presents to take to the king. And thus having been sent forth from the most sacred of all lands, we were sent away with a safe conduct, and came back to our own country, and the king received us with great joy and satisfaction. And having taken the gifts which had been brought by us, he showed them to the priests and other persons who were present, and offered sacrifices to God. He received the letter of the high priest and read it aloud in the hearing of the whole assembly, and having summoned Andreas, the chief of his bodyguard, and Aristeas, he commanded them to expound the laws of the Jews in the Greek tongue. And when they had done so, he gave orders that the sacred books should be preserved in the library in a conspicuous place. Having been honored by the presence of the high priest, and having witnessed the sacrifices and other solemn rites, the king sent away the men who had come with us, giving them great gifts and expressing the highest satisfaction with all that had been done. For he was profoundly impressed with their wise and religious ordinances, and thanked God for the happy termination of his undertaking. Such was the outcome of the mission which was carried out by me and my friends. And this was the substance of the decree which was published, and of the letters which were written. And thus, Philocrates, I have completed the account of all that was done on my embassy to Eleazar the high priest of the Jews, having accomplished all the objects which we had in view, and having been conducted on our way with honor and safety. So great was the virtue of these men, and the providence of God who ruleth all things. For he who directs the course of life and the dealings of men with man bringeth to naught the designs of those who are arrogant and proud, and scattereth their plans abroad. But he preserveth all those who are humble and righteous and severe in virtue. Thus, having been safely conducted through the whole of our mission, we departed in peace. And may the God who ruleth all things preserve you in good health, my dear brother, and you shall ever remain in the service of God and in obedience to his law. Farewell.